welcome to the meeting. Dear audience, welcome to the Global Young Scientist Summit in sunny Singapore. Of course, it's dark here already, but since we're all virtual, it doesn't really matter. And welcome to this panel on science and policy, where Professor Ramakrishnan and Professor Tan will discuss challenges and opportunities in public health policies in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Arguably, this is the most interesting panel of the whole summit, I would say. So welcome to this panel. We hope you enjoy it very much. My name is Vanessa Evers. I'm a professor of AI and robotics at NTU and director of NTU's Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity. And I'll be the moderator of this session. So we have about 1 hour today where we learn about the role of science in tackling the global pandemic, especially COVID-19. How to translate scientific findings to advice for governments, public health measures. We discuss interesting differences between different global regions and issues of trust in scientific results. So we realize, of course, it's very challenging to you to attend this summit virtually, also to our esteemed panelists. And some of you might be participating in very late hours in the night or very early hours in the morning. So despite the impossibility to meet our panelists physically, we hope to engage you very intensively. And we wish for your active participation. So Shensu, who you can't see, but who is here very active helping, and myself will scour the chat and read your thoughts, your questions, your reactions. We will try to address as many as we possibly can. Feel free to use the chat function to engage with the other members of the audience. Please post any questions that you have. When you ask a question, please start it with your full name and your affiliation so that we can refer to you personally. And if you have a super brilliant question, people can follow up with you afterwards. So I will now first introduce our discussants. Then we will have a very short introductory question discussion on the topic of science and COVID-19 policy measures before opening the floor up to your questions. So let me start with Professor Venkatraman Ramakrishnan. He is a biologist and Nobel Prize winner who has given the world many scientific contributions. Perhaps most important is his work on the atomic structure of the ribosome. We just heard a lot of information from Ada Yonath about the ribosome, so I knew nothing, and now I feel fully informed. That was a wonderful lecture. The ribosome is that part of living cells where genetic information is available to synthesize proteins from amino acids. By a greater understanding of the ribosome, many fundamental scientific contributions in biology were possible. So Prof Ramakrishnan is a super rainmaker in this field. Professor Ramakrishnan determined the atomic structure of the 30S ribosomal subunit, and consequently the structures of the entire ribosome in many different states and in interaction with antibiotics. More recently, his work centered around using electron microscopy to visualize ribosomes in action in higher organisms. I'm guessing a higher organism is like a person, an animal. I'm not sure where the higher starts. This work has advanced.
Even yeast. Even yeast is a higher organism.
Well, I feel less of a higher organism already. This work has advanced our understanding of how the ribosome works and how antibiotics affect it. In the past, he has also worked on histone and chromatin structures. I can only hope that I'm pronouncing that right, which helps us to understand how DNA is organized within cells. Professor Ramakrishnan received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his work on ribosomal structures. So, of course, the main question is, do you have the Nobel Prize medal right there in your room, and can we see it?
I'm sorry. It's in some...
Unfortunately, we'll have to do with the picture that we must have seen today. But also you were knighted in 2012. So I think that means that Her Majesty the Queen actually, took the sword and did the whole knighting. And again, we could spend half an hour just asking you how that experience was, but it's extremely impressive. You're also a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, and EMBO. You're a foreign member of the Indian National Science Academy. You were president of the Royal Society from November 2015 until very recently, I think November 2020. especially in this last role, you've been advising governments like the UK government on scientific results to influence their policies around COVID health measures. So there was a quote a comment that you made during our preparation discussion, which stuck and which I would like to give to the audience. And you said, it's the job of scientists to advise, and it's the job of governments to make policies. I think it's a beautiful description of your position in this. So I'll move on to Professor Prof Tan. You're holding 2 appointments simultaneously, and I'm already having trouble keeping one job down, so that's already very impressive. You are the Executive Director of the Office of Healthcare Transformation and the first Chief Health Scientist at the Ministry of Health. By background, you are a renal physician. I think that means you know about kidneys, if I'm correct. And you obtained your medical training at NUS, your research training at the Institute of Molecular Medicine at Oxford. You have served as the president of the National University of Singapore, NUS, from 2008 to 2017. You've been the provost, senior deputy president. You were also former dean of NUS Faculty of Medicine, and you served as the director of medical services for the Ministry of Health. Importantly, from 2000 to 2004, where you were responsible for leading the public health response to the 2003 SARS epidemic, which is, of course, extremely relevant today, this experience. You have many awards. It includes the Public Service Star in 2003 for outstanding contributions to overcoming SARS in Singapore, Public Administration Gold Medal for your work as Director of Medical Services, the Meritorious Service Medal 2015. I could go on and on. I'm just going to close it off a bit. You were awarded the National Science and Technology Medal in 2008. So I think next time we have this panel, I would really like to see all those medals, you know, like a general in the field to show on. It would be wonderful to see. And Prof Tan, you are the first Singaporean to be elected as an international member of the US National Academy of Medicine. So your experience in combating SARS and now the COVID-19 epidemic also makes you particularly relevant in this panel discussion on science and policy related to COVID-19. Something memorable that you mentioned in our preparation meeting is that we need to note the extraordinary achievements of science and the important role that science has played in battling the COVID-19 epidemic. I think that was a real eye-opener for me. So with that, I would like to start our discussion to introduce and get our audience ready to ask all their questions and thoughts. And I would like to start, Professor Ramakrishnan, with you, since you are our guest beaming in from furthest away. I was wondering if you could let us learn from your experience and your thoughts on what governments could do, to make sure that they are well informed about the latest scientific findings, and what may they keep in mind when they develop policies? What is important for them to think of?
Yeah, so I can tell you the attitude in the UK, how it works in the UK, and I think this is probably true in most advanced societies. What we have here is there's a general scientific community, there are science academies, etc., which can feed into government informally. But in addition, the government, as well as the individual government departments, all have scientific advisors. And for example, even the Foreign Office has a scientific advisor, because there's science matters even in foreign policy. For example, bioterrorism or nuclear proliferation, or even disasters, you know, natural disasters. So every department has a science advisor. There is also a Government Office of Science, which is headed by the Chief Scientific Advisor, who is Patrick Vallance. In addition, we have a Chief Medical Officer. So these are people who provide scientific input to the government. Now, unlike Singapore, most of our politicians are not, unlike the Singaporean Prime Minister, I should say, most of our politicians are not sort of trained in science or mathematics. And so there is this interface where scientists have to somehow portray in layman's terms what the situation is, and what the options are. And they also need to be forward-looking. For example, they need to anticipate problems. Not surprisingly, a pandemic was the #1 risk in the National Register risk for the last 10 years, so this should not have come as a surprise, even if it looked like it did. Now, the translation between science and policy is often a sort of gray area. In many cases, the politicians will say, okay, if this is what the science says, then I agree we should do this. But in other cases, there are competing interests. There'll be people who are sort of economists or other political groups who don't want, they may accept the science, but they don't want an action based on the science. So that's always a tricky area to negotiate.
Difficult. You also mentioned kind of combination, different views of people, how important they are.
Yes, it's one thing, for example, if scientists are united about, the explanation for something and what the response should be. But often there's disagreement. For example, in early 2020, there was a big debate about whether face masks were actually useful for the general public. Okay, and there were scientists who would argue that actually this is of no use at all. There are no clinical trials, there are no data. And then others who would say, well, actually, we know how droplets spread, and therefore, based on first principles, we ought to be using face masks. There's a question of how much asymptomatic transmission is responsible for infection spread. So those were all matters of scientific debate. And so then, a government official listening to competing views is going to have a harder time, deciding. Now, today, there's actually a debate going on whether it is okay to extend the interval between the first and second dose of a vaccine. So the manufacturer's guideline for Pfizer is, I think, 21 days, and for Moderna, it's about similar, 3 or 4 weeks. And the UK government is wondering whether it's, they should vaccinate more people by extending the interval between them. And there's very good evidence that might be a good strategy, but it is being debated, among various countries on whether that is appropriate or not.
Right, it's hard to get that certainty. As you are talking, there are actually quite a few questions coming in. I would like to kind of summarize them as, what do we do with politicians that don't listen, or that don't quite take what we say literally and then do something about that? How can we deal with politicians that are unknowledgeable, not willing to accept our findings? It's a hard.
I don't know. Cho Chuan, do you want to take that? Or, I mean, you're the one who's dealing with politicians, although I should say, because of your prime minister, it may be a different situation than if somebody has to deal with Mr. Trump, for example. So.
Yeah, I would say that it's very contextual. It's very contextual. And those of us who try to bridge between the worlds of science and policy making, we have to understand the cultures and the characteristics of both communities and try to understand how we can speak appropriately to each of them. So if you have politicians who appear to be very focused on a particular direction or particular idea, we often start by trying to understand, like, what is the basis? I mean, what is the reason? Are there things that they've read, or maybe there are tweets or there are social media posts about certain issues? Are there trade-offs? So we try to understand the policy-making background, the factors that are influencing the way people are looking at things. And then we ask ourselves, what is it that we have within the evidence base, within what we are doing as a scientific community that could address not just a general issue, but some of the more specific issues that might be at play. Yeah. So we have to try to play that role to try to understand the perspectives from both sides. And as Prof Ramakrishnan has said, one of the issues, of course, is particularly in a pandemic, policymakers are looking for clear-cut and fast decisions. Do we wear masks or don't we wear masks? Do we lock down or don't we lock down? And quite often there's a period of considerable uncertainty because the evidence base is just not there. And so those of us who have to sit in the interface between science and policy, we have to make a judgment call, make our best estimate of the situation, and in the face of incomplete evidence, provide recommendations. So often we don't have the luxury of having complete data, and we often don't have the luxury of time. And we just need to understand that the time frame and the dynamics of policy making are very, very different from that of a scientific community, and that the culture and the decision-making process are also quite different, because the types of trade-offs that policymakers have to consider are very, very different. So we have to try to understand these two worlds and try our best to bridge them.
Yes,
Yeah, so if I can add a little bit to that, I can give you a couple of examples. I think it's very important for politicians to see that it's actually in their interest to follow the science, even if it might not seem that way. So I'll give you two examples. One is I had to deal with Brexit for much of my term as Royal Society president. And of course, the government is dominated by people who are pro-Brexit, okay? So in this sort of atmosphere, I had to convince the government it's actually in the UK's interest to continue scientific collaboration with Europe. And it's a sort of win-win situation. I think once you put it in those terms and not as a sort of zero-sum game, then they will act. Similarly with COVID, there is this tension between economic downturn and public health control. And it's very important to convey to the government that these are not, they're not opposing situations, that actually by bringing the virus under control by good public health measures, you're laying the groundwork for quick recovery of the economy. So these are not opposites. And I think portraying it in ways that they find palatable is also useful, because they are pulled in lots of directions and not entirely by science.
You've both mentioned opinions, and Prof Tan, you mentioned social media. I was wondering if maybe, especially compared to when there was a SARS epidemic, do you feel that the context is now very different when it comes to access to information, differing opinions, social media? Dr. Ramakrishnan, you probably also have an opinion about these topics.
Well, it's like night and day. In 2003, SARS outbreak, there was no social media. All we had was emails and regular stuff. In the last pandemic, which was the 2009 H1N1 flu epidemic, I looked it up, and at that time in 2009, Facebook had 150 million followers, or 150 million users. And in 2020, there are 1.7 billion users. So this is a pandemic that's happening right in the middle of a social media era. And there are some positive things, I would say. Information dissemination is ultra fast. We can find out about things very quickly from all corners of the world. It helps us to learn very quickly from the experience of others. but there are also very, very difficult downsides. A lot of misinformation, a lot of just incorrect things, very general statements. People will say things like, well, RNA vaccines, they'll alter your DNA. No facts, no basis, but just because a lot of people send it around, then it becomes accepted as being correct. And the difficulty with that is also that the sort of authoritative voices become one of many voices, and people tend to listen to their peer groups as opposed to some central authority. And I think the main lesson that we draw from the different epidemics and outbreaks that we've come across is that it's really important to build trust during the peacetime period. Trust by being transparent, by being honest, by being open about data, and being very deliberate and purposeful about the way we push across data that we feel is correct and factual. And it's this trust between government and the citizenry, between communities within a society, I mean, that plays out at its best or worst in an outbreak like this. Because this pandemic really has shown up all the different differences in society. So if you have a society which has little trust and a lot of polarization before that, then the pandemic just makes it much worse. So even in a country which has tried to invest consistently in trust, it's also a major stress test. But having prior trust does stand us in good stead when we have to deal with infodemic as we have seen during this pandemic.
So I would just add that I'm more negative about social media. You've just heard Chuan talk about the downsides of social media, and they're extremely hard to combat, precisely because of what he said about the dilution of experts in this sea of noise in social media, and the resulting polarization as well, and echo chambers. And historically, I should point out, pandemics have brought out some of the worst in humanity, as well as some of the best, but often some of the worst. Racism, tribalism. You can go all the way back to the plagues of the 1400s to know how humans behave when they feel threatened. And it just brings out something negative. And we have to somehow, in this interconnected world, we have to try and overcome those kinds of tendencies. But I think it's hard.
Yes. I think this discussion addresses a few questions, one of them by Julia Emilia from KTH Sweden about the importance of public opinion. I think we've addressed it here. There was another question about bias in people, or people being hesitant to take the vaccine as they are being influenced in social media. So I think we are addressing some of these questions at the moment. Kind of the last discussion point before I open up and try to pull in more directly the questions that are being asked. There were also a few questions about this. I think Matthew from Singapore mentioned this. There was someone else from Thailand mentioning this, the different ways that different countries, different regions respond to the pandemic. And you've already hinted towards it, but we'd love to hear a little bit more of your reflection on how come that some countries seem to be on top of it, some countries don't. Is there anything that scientists can do? What could the role be to influence governments?
Well, on a very broad basis, I mean, if you look at cases, mortality, outbreaks, generally, I think the countries in East Asia, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, probably could add Singapore as well, have done relatively well. And I think there are a number of reasons that may be responsible for this. The first is these are the places which had epidemics like SARS, MERS, avian flu in the past. And what this has done has been to spur a tremendous investment in epidemic preparedness in all these countries. Very, very substantial investments in people, in processes, in stockpiles, in facilities, at a time where generally in many countries in the West, in fact, investments in public health have declined very substantially. Another factor is that we also therefore have a cadre of medical people, public health professionals, frontliners, as well as the public who are familiar with epidemic. So many people in Singapore still remember the SARS epidemic of 2003. I mean, compared with what we have now, actually, it's a very, very small event. But at that time, I mean, it was just such a incredible, unprecedented dislocation for the entire society. And as a result of that, people are familiar with it, and therefore certain things like more communitarian measures, wearing masks, being responsible not just for yourself, but for others, I think have also become more rooted. Two final things I think which may be worth mentioning. One is, as Prof Ramakrishnan has said, political leadership has been an important factor, but also the willingness to adapt new strategies and new technologies. So in Korea, in Taiwan, and in China, you see a lot of use of data analytics, of digital technologies, and also learning very quickly from the experience of others to innovate new ways of dealing with outbreaks. I think these combination of factors have in several ways contributed to the relatively better response. But you know, this is a long game. It's a long game, and this is a tricky virus, and we just have to always be very alert because things can change very quickly.
There are actually quite a few experiences coming in from the audience.
Yeah.
It's Eric David Ornos from the University of
Vanessa, could I add a little to that question? Because I think it is important. So from my perspective, it is surprising that, you know, if you looked at the Global Health Forum's prediction of which countries were best prepared for a pandemic, okay? This is about a year and a half ago. UK and the US were number 1 and number 2, okay? And they have not done so well. And, you know, it's striking how Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia have done so well consistently. And I think there's more to it than just that. I think there is something about every country has a balance between individual rights and community responsibilities. And where that balance lies is different for different regions of the world. And I think in the West, there's a great emphasis on individual rights, especially in what I would call the Anglo-Saxon countries, Britain and the US. It's very tilted towards individual rights. And I think in Asia, there's perhaps more importance to community responsibilities. And so this kind of libertarianism versus communitarianism, that, you know, balance is okay when there's no pandemic. You know, there's advantages to having lots of individual rights, etc. But in a situation of public crises, war is one example, but a pandemic is another example. You do have to have shift that balance, and that is not you know, straightforward to do so culturally. And I think that may be part of the reason for the different, you know, differences in outcome anyway.
That's very interesting. A couple of people reflect on this idea of, are there cultural differences? Someone mentioned also you can be prepared as a country, but you may not prioritize the COVID crisis. So while the US was able to run a very smooth election against all expectations, they didn't prioritize COVID, and that didn't roll out as smoothly as they would. So this is, it
And this is something that Chuan alluded to. If you had already had to deal with pandemics like the SARS epidemic and so on, then you in your mindset you realize how dangerous it is. Whereas in the West, they all saw these epidemics break out in East Asia and somehow fizzle out before they came to the West. And so they didn't take it as seriously as they might have, perhaps. I'm not talking about the scientists, but I think in terms of public attitudes.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I think with this, we've discussed questions by Eric David Ornos from the University of Philippines, Rachanand, Firi J. Kid Kosol. I hope I pronounced your name well, as well. So with that, I think we should open up questions to the floor. We've actually been incorporating them a little bit. A lot of them are also in response to what we were saying. And there's quite a few questions around what can we do as scientists? So is there a place where is there a way that we could learn a little bit more about influencing policy? Is there any formal training, perhaps? What is your experience on how to get better at it? And let me find some of the names of people that asked that. Let's see. There was a lady from Caro that I will find as you reflect on this. Sorry.
So I think there are a number of forums, and one particular one is that many countries are now have started or are about to start young academies. This is early career scientists becoming more involved in general aspects of science, including science policy, whereas before, young scientists would entirely focus on their own research. Now they're encouraged maybe to spend some of their time on these broader issues, such as science culture, science policy, etc. And so perhaps we should encourage more forums where people can contribute. Another very important thing that young scientists can do is public engagement, because it is very important to get the public on your side in terms of science. And the more scientists engage with the public, the better it is. And the fact that scientists are not these old males, kind of running labs, but they're young people and they're quite diverse and they can be different types of role models. That's also a good message. So I would encourage young scientists to go and reach out to the public, talk to schools, give public lectures, etc.
Yeah, and I would like to maybe add a couple of points to what Prof Ramakrishnan says. I think it's really important to develop a genuine interest in many disciplines. Not that we're trying to master them, but just to understand some of these disciplines, because quite often when you have to advise policy, we have to cross many disciplines and not just rely on one or two. This is a public health crisis, but so many other things, social behavior, economics. So I would say build your networks, get interested, when you can, listen in, tune into what other disciplines are talking about, and also build networks across countries, because that comes out very, very usefully when we have a pandemic like this. And as Prof Ramakrishnan says, of course, being familiar with policymakers also helps. So I think building up your networks and understanding different disciplines would be a very useful thing. A second thing is that there are many ways to influence policy, and some of them can be done through translation of your work. And in this pandemic, we've seen really fantastic examples of how young scientists have innovated, converted their ideas into products, test kits, things that have been of great service, and the adoption of these at scale, say in Singapore, is a really powerful way of helping to influence at least the way the pandemic is being managed. And I think the third one I would suggest, very much in line with what Prof Ramakrishnan mentioned, is really try and practice explaining your work in science accurately but simply. Because quite often, as scientists, we tend to speak in caveats, under these conditions, if these are met, and if you exclude these things, then this could be with a certain degree of probability, by the time you say all that, most lay people have lost confidence in us.
One U.S. Senator Muskie, said that on his committees, he only wanted testimony from one-armed scientists, because scientists keep saying, on the other hand,
Maybe. So
yeah, so I'm not saying you should be, you shouldn't speak factually. I'm saying that we try to learn how to speak factually, but simply. That's a real skill.
This is very important feedback. We can only hope that all the young people here in this meeting are now going to go out and try and visit as many schools as they can, rack up all this experience to inform. So that's great. And the question was actually asked by Advati from India, Helena from Spain, and Christopher from the Philippines. So we just got a question in from someone at Wageningen University, and I'm Dutch, so I'm going to completely give them, ahead of everybody else, which is totally unfair. But basically, the suggestion from Josep Paul at Wageningen University is, what about a board of science community, like publicly announcing their thoughts to people? I guess it's similar to World Health Organization type of body, but then maybe more generally scientific. The idea behind it is that there's an alternative option without the political influence. What is your thought on that?
Well, we have that already, in the sense the Royal Society, for example, is an independent organization. We've often criticized the government. The U.S. National Academy in Singapore. I think all of these already exist. I think that the problem is scientists in some quarters are perceived as part of the elite, part of the establishment. And that's the thing that's harder to tackle. How do we, so when we argue about climate change, or that COVID is actually real and it's important and it's a problem, and other people say it's a hoax and climate change is a hoax, how do we get across? That's a more difficult question, and I think it has to do with greater engagement. And I saw in the chat box somebody said more education. I think that is really a key. And education doesn't have to be just school. It can be through lots of other ways of learning a bit about the world and why scientists think the way they do.
I'll just add that it's a kind of a timeliness, and there's a time when some things are very, very important in the views of the public, and there are other times when they are not. So let's say in January of 2020, we had a scientific group talking a lot about masks. I think in most parts of the world, people would kind of think that this is, a non-issue. I mean, why on earth are you talking about masks? But if you fast forward to April or May, then everything is about masks, about aerosols, about transmission. So the point I'm making is that there is also, that's what we want to say as scientists, but we also need to understand and be attuned to what are people most concerned about, most interested in at a particular moment in time. And in the case of a pandemic, where everything has to move very, very fast, it means we have to assemble our resources very quickly so that we can give timely advice at a time when the issue is most topical. And that is a time when it probably has the most traction. But if if we went about our usual way and produced a review article 1 year after that, then it may be a superb article, but it would have very little impact on the policy. So I would say it's a matter of finding the right topics at the right time and being able to work with speed and with rigor to produce something which can really effectively influence the debate.
It's a lot of pressure on scientists to be able to do all that.
Yes. And I think to the credit of scientists around the world, I mean, people work day and night, to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think there is one important point is that when scientists try to explain things or put forth their opinions, it's very, very important to tell the public why you think a certain way so that it doesn't get politicized. I notice in chat box there are questions about politicization of science. And I think if we make clear why we believe what we do and what the process is by which we arrived at those conclusions, that's quite important. Whether it's face masks or climate change or whatever it is, I think it's important.
And let me link to that, which is a really important point, is the preserving trust in our institutions.
Right.
So if you're a regulatory agency, whether you're FDA or Singapore's Health Sciences Authority, people have to trust that your judgments are completely objective to the best of your ability, and not because someone is leaning on you to decide one way or the other.
Absolutely.
So the institutional backbone, particularly at a time of crisis, is what people will remember for future crises, and it's part of the trust building process in the long term.
There are actually quite a few questions in the chat around this topic, especially people feeling maybe a little bit insecure about whether they could actually influence government officials to that extent. It just scrolled off the screen. I was just looking at someone from the Sutarini Nagurna mentioned that some situation like COVID, it challenges people, but sometimes politicians, the decisions that politicians solving the pandemic are different from what scientists and researchers advise. So how do you solve this issue? How do you get, I guess the point is it's hard for us scientists to solve that issue, right?
Yeah, I think in different countries, it works in different ways. I can speak mainly of Singapore, where I think building the trust between the scientists and key scientists in the community and the policymakers is very important. And then those of us who are more familiar with the policy-making world become the people who reach out to other scientists who help us to generate the evidence, the data, and arguments for or against a certain policy position. So again, I think it goes back to prior relationships. If you didn't have a good and trusted working relationship before you started, then it's much, much harder, because you start from a position of mistrust, and it's then very, very difficult to advance anything, even if it's very, very well argued.
Yeah, maybe related to that, Kritsa from the Philippines and Surabi from India have this idea of how to it might be possible to more concretely build up science advice capabilities or science policy capabilities for global crisis, rather than kind of ad hoc. We have a crisis now, we go to our scientists, we tell them to produce a lot of science. And is that at all possible to build up like a trustworthy base?
I think so. I think certainly in the UK, there's just an ongoing, as I mentioned, there's not only a government Department of Science, but there's an independent Council of Science and Technology, which is an advisory committee, which tackles both immediate as well as long-term issues. They vary from anything like how do you deal with an aging society? I mean, that's something that concerns a lot of countries. So I think that's an ongoing thing. The question of how you influence a government that's not willing to listen to mainstream science, that I don't think has an answer. That is a political problem, not a scientific problem. You have to change the politics, to improve that. And there, I think public engagement would be helpful. If you get the public on your side and say, look, the whole world is doing this and we believe this and this is the reason, and look, these people who are governing you, are morons. They're not listening to you, and that's a way to implement change. Okay, so
I also wanted to kind of stress the importance of international collaborations, particularly during this pandemic. I think we've seen unprecedented levels of sharing, both at the science and the science policy level. So, for example, myself, I benefited a lot by talking to science and policy counterparts in the UK, in the US, in Australia, and many parts of the world. And it's really very helpful to be able to do a quick call, 15, 30 minutes, discuss issues, find out some data that's not in the public domain yet, share your own experience. So those kinds of informal types of networks and engagement are also really very important. They are not a formal structure, but they are really important in helping to deal with a fast-moving pandemic.
Yes. There are a couple of questions, a couple of people. One of them is Raphael Spiekerman. I'm trying to find the others as well. And they address this issue of that science is sometimes either seen as aligned to a particular political way of thinking, for instance, the more left, more social way of thinking. And especially in countries where politicians lean more towards the right or center right, that might be perceived as problematic. It's kind of like they're totally different people. It's hard for them to listen to each other. The question is whether you have any experiences with that. You might reflect on it based on your experience in different countries.
So if I can go first, I'm a US and UK citizen, so I know this problem rather well. And it is striking how in the last 4 years, although, the UK is also a sort of what I would call a conservative government, relatively right-wing, and the US is a Republican right-wing government, the response has been very different. In the UK, the difference between, many scientists probably didn't vote for Boris Johnson, but nevertheless, there is a healthy dialogue between scientists and the government, and there's a healthy sort of interaction. In the US, that interaction actually broke down in the last year or so. And so I think what scientists can do is they have to set aside their politics. For example, I voted to remain in the EU, but I didn't bring my Remain political views when I talked to the government about what should we do after Brexit, and how should we engage with the EU. You have to try to separate your personal political views from the science and engage with the government purely on the basis of evidence and what is best for the country. And that's, I think, the way forward. I think it's a very important point, though, because academia generally tends to be very left-wing, and much more so than the public as a whole. And so it is our responsibility to engage with it. And that's, this polarization you see, especially in the UK and the US and many other parts of the world, between what they think of as a left-wing elite and the sort of masses who are sort of disillusioned and left behind. We need to somehow bridge that gap.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I would underscore that point. I think it's very difficult if science becomes politicized, and we can't actually influence the way people manage the politics, and we can't convince everybody about everything. But as individuals, as responsible scientists, as responsible people who are trying to bridge between science and policy, I think we have to be as objective as we can, because in the longer term, that is what makes us trusted voices in the community. If once people suspect that we are driven by other agendas besides science, then of course we will lose a lot of the trust of some segment of the population. And it need not just be left or right. I mean, it can be different types of social divisions. And so we can't be right all the time, but at least as Prof Ramakrishnan says, if we provide a basis why we say the things we do and why we recommend the things that we do, and if we are honest and transparent, then eventually I think that pays really importantly to building up the long-term trust in yourself as a respected voice in the community.
We are slowly running into the last 5 minutes of our panel, unbelievably, and we have about 180 questions that we still need to address. So I'm just going to make a lucky dip in the last couple of questions. Valentino from Italy and John from the Philippines address different questions, but they are both around this idea of social science, social responsibility of governments, more focus on societal impact, maybe rather than just hardcore scientific results. Is there a way, is it helpful? Is there a way to bring together more the social sciences and the natural sciences? Is that also a road that you see is important?
So if I may go first, I think you need a portfolio because we do need the people to develop the diagnostic tests and new therapeutics and do the modeling, which are more technical, and so you do need strengths in those areas. But I do agree that we are learning now also about the importance of behavioral sciences, social sciences, in understanding how people react to messages, why they behave the way they do, etc., etc. And therefore, within our portfolio, we should also have a very strong focus on the humanities and social sciences. And the hard part, of course, is how to bridge between these different disciplines in order to address a specific issue within a pandemic. I mean, that is really very difficult, but it's really quite necessary. So I mean, if you go back to this issue of mask wearing, yes, I mean, we can develop a perfect mask, but then why do most people not use it? You know, and under what situations would people use it more than others? You know, how do you motivate people? How do you combat fatigue? I mean, those are not just hard science questions. I mean, they're very important behavioral questions, and we do need our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences to help us address these issues.
Yeah, I think, for example, many of the things that we rely on, even the sequencing of the virus, came out of basic science. When Sanger invented DNA sequencing or somebody invented PCR, they had no idea that there was going to be a pandemic 50 years later that would, use their methodology. So we have to think about supporting science in all of its different aspects, much like an investment fund manager is not going to put all his money into one sector. They're going to put it into a variety of sectors. And so I think that's how we ought to view it, that you don't know where the next important thing is going to come from. And I agree completely with Cho Chuan about the importance of integrating social and economic sciences, behavioral and economic sciences with, the sort of natural sciences.
Yes.
I mean, I'll just give you a small example. Before the pandemic, no one ever thought about bioaerosol research, right? I mean, how our aerosols form, propagate.
Yes, exactly.
It's not something that you have picked. But I mean, in the middle of last year, there was a big issue, and so I looked around, and luckily we had 5 or 6 groups that work on bioaerosols in Singapore, and boy, did they come useful. So I mean, the point that Prof Ramakrishnan has made, if we had picked the types of research that we think would be important, we probably would not pick bioaerosols.
Yeah, it's hard to predict. So we are nearing the end. There are still so many interesting questions. There are a couple for instance, Yusang Dorji from Bhutan and some others, they address things like social isolation, inequality. Others have addressed the problem of socioeconomic differences between people. That might also be a big issue, apart from the kind of cultural and governmental systems that we addressed before. We could have another hour-long panel session, but we have to close off. And I wanted to ask each of you, maybe you could leave us with a Yoda-like line of wisdom, maybe something unexpected, something that may not be so obvious to young scientists, of what they could take away from this session. Very good.
No pressure, right?
Or just you could also give us, I'm now counting myself as a young scientist. Give us.
So maybe I just respond very quickly to the last question, which I think is very important. And the issue is a very pertinent one, that we can measure the effect of the epidemic, but we are not able to really measure the true impact of the social isolation, mental health, and so on. And it's something for the next epidemic. We really have to have much better ways of understanding this so that we can calibrate our responses. But for the Yoda-like response, all I can say is that adaptability, flexibility of thinking, and just being imaginative are very important for epidemic, because no matter how much we prepare, there are going to be new things. And if we have whatever resources we have, and also our friends overseas, just finding creative ways to best make use of our capabilities, we find some really, really amazing and innovative things coming out. So even though no one had prepared for it, it's just the nature of human creativity in response to a real crisis. I think that's something that's been very striking and very admirable during this period all around the world. And I hope we'll be able to preserve at least some of this, flexible creativity in response to real problems, even as we exit this pandemic.
So what I would say is that we need to learn some general lessons from the pandemic. And one of them is that we need to build in resilience. This is not going to be the last pandemic, and it's not also going to be the last kind of disaster. There's going to be cyber terrorism and climate change and many other big crises. And we need to somehow build in resilience into the way we do things. A second is we should learn from this what our values are. We talk about essential workers. These are all the worst paid workers in society. Suddenly they've become essential workers, okay? So maybe our value system needs to take into account what is actually important, in what people do. And also the question of minimizing inequalities. I think this is a chance to try to see if we can build up in a way that gives people more opportunities and fewer inequalities. I think those are some lessons we could draw, but I'm not optimistic given the 1918 pandemic and how people just went back to business as usual.
We shall never fly again. So, thank you so much for these words of wisdom. It's super inspiring. From the reactions in the chat, it's really clear that this was a wonderful session. As I said, the best session of the whole summit. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for your fantastic moderating of the session.
Yeah, thanks so much, Vanessa. And thanks.
It was a pleasure to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.